Imagine you're comfortably chilling at your computer, watching your favorite Force gaming videos, when all of a sudden someone busts into your room, heads straight for your stash of games, and grabs your prized collector's edition copy of Babylon's Fall. On their way out, they turn to you saying, "If you try playing this ever again, I'll sue." Well, this isn't some made-up story, minus a few of the specific details. This is our reality. The burglar in this case is Square Enix, and they may as well have broken into your home because come February 28th, they have stolen your copy of Babylon's Fall. If you try to play the game once official support ends via piracy and/or private servers, they could sue for copyright infringement. Crazy as that sounds, it's happened. Just last year, in fact, Atlus sued fans for preserving a game that they killed off back in 2013. But Square Enix and Atlus aren't the only ones busting into your house with sticky fingers. Right behind them is Ubisoft, Electronic Arts, Epic Games, Bandai Namco, NCSoft, LucasArts, Warner Bros, Daybreak Games, Red 5 Studios. The list is large and it is ever growing. These robberies already took place, and in all but a few cases, you ain't getting your stuff back. It doesn't matter if you purchased the base game for $60, spent extra on a collector's edition, or even more for that pre-release early access version, nor does it matter if you bought multiple years worth of season passes on top of paying for cosmetic skins, loot boxes, and maybe even some convenience features here and there. Hey, you could have spent hundreds or thousands of dollars on a game that was initially free to play even, and none of that matters. The game has been shut down, its servers taken offline, and you're not allowed to play it ever again. This is our reality as it stands. While there is hope and a path forward for things to change, at the moment, if a company decides to stop supporting a game while also choosing not to give consumers any legal means of continuing to play, you're just out of luck. The money you spent was for the time that you've already played, and you have no opportunity outside of piracy to revisit the game in the future. This is a major shame for games preservation. It's even more of a shame for consumer rights, and depending on what part of the world that you're from, what they're doing may actually be illegal. But for the time being, expect these companies to keep coming, likely with increased frequency in the next few years, and they're here to take your games as a service. Also known as live service games, though don't get hung up on the use of the word service here. Despite its presence, according to the law in most of the world, nearly every live service game you know of is legally considered a good and not a service, which has pretty dramatic implications on whether or not companies can permanently revoke your access. No matter what their end user license agreement states, it runs contrary to the law, and as such, it is void. Now, as for what makes a game a good versus a service, just calling it a service doesn't really cut it, nor again does whatever it says in the EULA, but we'll touch on the legal distinctions between the two a little later in the video. For now, let's talk about the live service model. Many consider this a modern trend popularized by titles like Fortnite, League of Legends, or Destiny. Games in this category are typically defined not only by their requirement to connect to servers in order to play, but also by their business models and post-launch support. The idea being that the release of the game marks not the end of development, but rather the beginning of a new phase, with most live service games coming with the promise of continuous future updates funded by additional player spending. But games as a service isn't a new phenomenon. This model has actually been around for upwards of 25 years, some of the earliest examples being the MMOs of the mid to late 90s. Ultima Online, EverQuest, and Asheron's Call are just a few examples of games that launched back in that day with a promise of continued support, and that's exactly what they got, with balance patches, content updates, and expansions that greatly expanded upon the base game for many years. And at the time, this was fairly uncommon, as most games that came out around 95 to 2000 were pretty much just one and done deals. Like, developers would make a game, they would release it, and you got what you got upon purchase. If there were broken levels, game-breaking bugs, glitches, or design flaws, they just stayed in the game. In fact, many modern-day speedrunners of old games rely upon these various bugs and glitches to do the things that they do, clipping through terrain, teleporting across the map, and one-shotting bosses. In these particular instances, the unpatched bugs turned into unintended features. But the speedrunning aspect aside, aside, the larger point is that back in the mid-90s, a broken or busted game almost never got fixed. This was largely due to consumer internet still being fairly new. Not everyone had it in their homes, nor was it very reliable if you did. So how are you going to get an update? Like, were publishers supposed to mail you a new copy of the updated version of the game? Well, in some cases, yes, that's actually exactly what happened. There are several examples of patches and updates for new versions of games being mailed to consumers in the 1990s, but again, at the time, this was very much the exception and not the rule. Nearly as uncommon back then were games getting post-release content. For the most part, after launching a game, studios would begin working on a sequel or move on to entirely new projects. Of course, content updates did exist in the form of expansions. I know personally, I remember being super pumped for checking out like Diablo's Hellfire expansion or Warcraft 2's Beyond the Dark Portal. But again, at this particular time, this was not the norm. Generally speaking, there was no consistent expectation of regular updates for most of the games that we played. As time progressed, internet at home became more popular and more readily available. This in turn brought changes to what developers could do in terms of fixing their games, but also updating them with more content outside of the typical video game expansion. One of the first large-scale mainstream examples of a successful games as a service is undoubtedly the World of Warcraft. After its initial release in November 2004, the game got 12 major patches, adding an array of new content. There were new items, seasonal events, new dungeons and raids, additional overland content like the inclusion of world bosses. We saw new features like the meeting stones and PvP honor systems, additional PvP battlegrounds were added, brand new quest hubs, more new dungeons and raids, more seasonal and even world events. The game even got entirely new zones added to it, just a massive list of brand new content that also came with many more minor updates and fixes in between, all added at a consistent interval from the game's initial release right up until its first major expansion. The Burning Crusade, which came out in 2006, more or less added an entirely new game's worth of content on top of what was already there. This set a massive new precedent on what was possible for updates to a game that had already been released. And I think this was a major tipping point for consumer expectations. The World of Warcraft certainly wasn't the first implementation of this. As I mentioned, many MMOs came before it that did similar, but I do think this was definitely like a keystone moment. Like, sure, people knew about EverQuest and Ultima Online, but it was World of Warcraft whose marketing featured the likes of William Shatner and Jean-Claude Van Damme and Ozzy Osbourne and Chuck Norris. It was World of Warcraft that had an entire South Park episode made about it. It was World of Warcraft that had Super Bowl commercials. Point being, I definitely think it's pretty clear that WoW was the first large game with widespread appeal and a major cultural zeitgeist that kind of lifted the veil for a large number of players, of gamers, of consumers of games into the world of games as a service. For many people, myself included, this was really the first big introduction. In the years following WoW's release from around 2005 to 2019, we started to see more games as a service hit the market. While these were still predominantly MMOs, live service games in other genres started cropping up. We saw Team Fortress 2, League of Legends, Rock Band, Battlefield 2142, and Auto Assault, just to name a few. And then between 2010 and 2015, all of a sudden we were seeing live service games in just about every single genre. StarCraft 2, Need for Speed World, Darkspore, Age of Empires Online, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Dota 2, Marvel Heroes, FIFA World, Destiny, WildStar, Firefall, H1Z1. From then on out, it was pretty obvious that the floodgates had opened wide, and with each passing year, the percentage of live service games to non-live service games grew and grew, bringing us all the way up to today in early 2023, at which point just about every game that comes out is a live service, barring a few select AAA titles and much of the indie market. In fact, I can only think of a handful of games that I've played over the last few years that weren't a live service. Now remember, when we're talking about live service, the classification is either A, the game requires an internet connection to play, and if you can't connect to the servers, you can't access that game, and or the game has some sort of post-release content schedule and corresponding monetization. And in many cases, your access to any live service game is fully dependent on the publisher's continued support. Should they decide to close up shop and shut down the game's servers, whether or not you'll be able to ever play again or get a return on any of the money that you paid is entirely up to their discretion. And over the past 20 years, when a company did decide to end support for a live service title, guess what concessions were made to allow the consumers to continue paying the product that they played for? In a majority of cases, nothing. Nothing is done, and these games just die, and you lose total access to it. So how did we get here? Well, the explanation is really simple as to why live service games became so popular. From the consumer standpoint, on its face, the model sounds like a great deal. There's this game, I really enjoy playing it, and I can keep on happily playing knowing that it will continue to get updates and improvements with time, especially for people who only purchase or invest their time in a handful of games each year. This is a no-brainer. Like back in the day, when all I played was World of Warcraft, you bet I was happy that the game kept on getting updates patch after patch with new content, new zones, new dungeons, new raids, new stuff to do, new features. Back when this was the only game that I was playing, that was amazing. I was absolutely thrilled. So for me and for other consumers, this aspect of live service games is great. As for the standpoint of the developers and the publishers, well, I mean, compared to the old model of like games that had a one-time purchase and were playable offline, not connected to their stores and cash shops, games as a service makes a ton more money. In 2021, EA said that of the $1.85 billion in revenue they earned that year, only a third came from initial box sales. The rest, which amounted to $1.1 billion, was from microtransaction earnings in their live service games. So that was people spending money on cosmetics and other items in Apex Legends, FIFA, Battlefield, The Sims, and Star Wars: The Old Republic, to name a few. And we've seen similar reports from other major companies over the years. From 2012 to 2018, Activision Blizzard saw its market value grow from $10 billion to $60 billion, which they attributed largely to their adoption of the live service model. In fact, the trend towards games as a service is said to have tripled the value of the entire games industry. So consumers like it because the games we enjoy keep getting updates, and companies like it because it makes them way more money than selling a game for a fixed upfront price. And if that's all that came from the exchange, no problem. Like, it sounds like a win-win, but in reality, that is not where the story ends. Thanks to the profit incentive of this model, games are being made in ways that are designed to keep us engaged. Excuse me. To keep us paying. Season passes with limited time events and rewards that we'll want to buy before time runs out. Daily and weekly quests with limited time rewards that have us logging in every day and also interacting with the shops and battle pass systems. Digital shops with limited time sales that we'll want to make use of this discounted cosmetic before the price gets increased, and progression systems that are designed using the exact same methods as casino slot machines. I'd go as far as to say they're objectively making our games worse, putting up barriers so they can sell the means to bypass them, and pulling out every trick in the book to keep us hooked. But we're not hooked because the games are so good or so novel or so interesting. They can be that, but nowadays companies have also honed their ability to trigger a little neurotransmitter called dopamine, knowing just how powerful of a motivator that is for keeping us engaged. And the longer we're engaged, the better the odds are that we're going to be spending. Now, beyond the fact that this push towards the live service model is altering for the worse, I'd argue, how our games are designed, there's also the fact that we've seemingly just had our ownership rights to the goods we purchase swept out from under us. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen numerous announcements of live service games, some of which launched less than a year ago, already planning to shut down in the immediate or near future. Babylon's Fall, which launched in March 2022, shuts down in just a few days. Rumbleverse, which launched in August 2022, also shuts down in just a few days. Crossfire X will be ending services in May. Back 4 Blood is ending further support later this year, and so is Marvel Avengers, Knockout City, and Apex Legends Mobile. These are just recent examples over the past couple of weeks of prominent live service games that are coming to an end. Over the last 10 or so years, there's been roughly 150 live service games that were shut down. In every one of these cases, publishers are halting service due to lack of financial viability, basically. These are games that just weren't making enough money. And that alone isn't a problem. No one is trying to force a company to develop new content or support a game that no longer makes financial sense. Of course, they are not going to do that. The potential problem, and the one that has played out for us, is how exactly they go about ending their support. Now, in the ideal scenario, especially for any games that we paid for with an upfront box price, anyone who purchased said game should still have means to play the game. If that title required connection to some official servers, that would mean dropping that requirement, or in the case where some of the game's data was stored on those servers, they should find a way to make that data available. This is not, as you may be led to believe, an impossible task, totally within their capability, and in many cases may not even take that much work. This isn't a universal solution, and things do get trickier in the case of, say, subscription-based games like MMOs, where a large portion of the game is stored server-side, but there are solutions to help both preserve these games and allow continued access to its paying customers long after companies drop support. And that really is the direction that I hope we're able to move in the future, whether that requires legal intervention from the court systems in various parts of the world or otherwise, which I'll touch on right now. There's a really great video by Cursed Farms titled "Games as a Service is Fraud." In this, he lays out in painstaking, in-depth detail the legal definitions of both goods and services, along with court cases from across the world in which most of the games that we call live services are in fact considered goods, and for that reason, how companies have no right to revoke access to those goods despite what their end user license agreement states. In very, very oversimplified terms, any game that you make a one-time upfront purchase of has a perpetual software license, and in turn is legally considered a good with ownership rights transferable to you after you purchase said product. Any game whose access is gated behind a subscription software license, like for example World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, can be considered a service with rights non-transferable. So in the case of those subscription-based games, revoking access is entirely within the company's legal right. That doesn't make it the right thing to do, especially when it comes to games preservation, but I'm not here to pretend that companies have any obligation or desire to do something just because it's what's right. They don't, and they probably won't. But remember, just because a company calls its game a live service or a games as a service doesn't actually make it a service by legal definition. If you are not paying a subscription fee for a game, then its purchase is done under a perpetual license which comes with the transfer of ownership. This has been tried in multiple courts across the globe. The European Union's highest court, the Court of Justice, has ruled that software, whether physical or digital, represents a good rather than a service, and that any purchaser of a perpetually licensed software becomes the exclusive owner over that instance of software, just as when they purchase any physical good. Australia also ruled that games are goods in its case versus Valve, where they state each of Valve's challenges to the applicability of the Australian consumer law fails. Valve supplies goods which are defined as including computer software. And our neighbor to the north, Canada, has also ruled that software as a service is still considered a good. Now, here in the US, our courts seem to be lagging a bit behind on this front, with multiple rulings both for and against games being classified as goods. But to date, even though precedent has been set, none of these cases have made their way all the way to this US Supreme Court, so we are actually still in a bit of legal limbo. But regardless, for courts in many parts of the world, games that aren't locked behind recurring subscriptions are goods, and in turn, that means you legally have a perpetual license to your copy of that good, which would mean for the somewhere of 150 live service games that have been shuttered thus far, legally, you should still have access to be able to play them. And in most cases, you can't. Now, there's a lot more nuance to this than what I've discussed here, so if you're interested, I highly recommend checking out that Accursed Farms video. But yeah, the short of it is, if we bought a game, we should still be able to play it long after the publisher drops support. Even if they are calling that game a live service or games as a service, it doesn't matter. In some cases, and even in some examples of some of the recent games that are going to be shutting down, the companies are still allowing people to play these games offline, just losing access to certain features and functionality that are tied directly to the servers. And I think for the most part, the way they're approaching that is totally fine. But when these games that we paid for or we spent a large amount of money on all of a sudden just disappear, that is where I feel like it becomes a lot more of an issue. So what's next? Like, where do we go from here? Well, in terms of the trend of live service games, it's not going anywhere. With the recent slew of games getting shut down, I've seen various articles and threads claiming that this marks the end of games as a service, and we'll be going back to the good old days of games with one upfront box price that are playable offline and have no season pass or cash shop. No, that ain't happening. Just forget about it. Games as a service isn't dying. Individual games that are games as a service are dying, but the trend is absolutely not. Because as we've established, it is insanely popular. It's popular among consumers because the games that they love are getting regular updates, and it's popular amongst companies because they're enjoying record-breaking profits. Even with all of the recent examples of games dying and being taken offline, there's really little reason for companies not to just keep making them, because what's the harm? Whether you released a game with one upfront cost or a game as a live service full of microtransactions, if the player base dies, it dies. You've already sold what you're gonna sell, and at least with the live service model, you get the opportunity to make a little extra cash. Companies aren't any worse off by taking a swing at a live service. For them, there is very little downside and a potentially massive upside. And when a player base eventually dies, as it does for typically most every game with a rare few exceptions, well, we've seen exactly what happens. They just shut it down, they take their profits, and they move on to the next thing. Like, sure, maybe they get some angry videos or articles or tweets written about them, but who cares? People move on and they forget about it. So we've established games as a service is here to stay. It's not going anywhere, but at the same time, as I went into detail earlier in the video, the current model of us just losing access to these goods that we've paid for at the whims of a games company, that doesn't cut it either. Something has to change. Here's what I foresee happening in the next 5 to 10 years of live service games. So I expect the big AAA companies are going to just keep making these because of course they are. They've got the money to throw around and take these shots at becoming the next big thing. That said, I also expect them to try to start mitigating the risks a bit more. With so many live service games out there, it's pretty clear that the market is reaching some sort of a saturation point. People just don't have enough time or enough interest to play multiple of these types of games at once. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if we start to see fewer free-to-play live service games. In exchange, we're going to get more full-price games that are also having the live service model, which then lets them make their money up front. If it fails, they drop support. If it's successful, they just make more money. The games as a service will keep coming out, and for each of them, the question isn't if, but when they get shut down. And I think that is where we'll need to start seeing a change from how things currently operate. I figure that as time goes on and more high-profile examples of games get shut down, we will also start to see more court cases across the world, including here in the US, that will set a greater precedent and force some sort of a change for how the sunsetting of these games is handled. Remember, it's not about forcing companies to support a game that is no longer popular and is no longer profitable. No one reasonable is thinking that's going to happen or asking for that. It's about preserving the games and providing a legal means for paying customers, people who spent money on these things, who gave the companies money, to continue playing them legally without having to pirate and without having to risk getting sued for copyright infringement because the company no longer wants to support the game. This is both for the benefit of the consumer, but also for games preservation. There are so many games that, unless these private servers start popping up, already are just lost to time or at the whims of the rights holders re-releasing them in some form or another. The thing is, a reality exists where this stuff is better managed. It's not our current reality, but it very well could be, and that is what I'm hoping we can move towards in the future. We'll have to see what the upcoming years of games as a service hold for us. They're not going anywhere. Expect to keep seeing more battle passes and live services, and as soon as it gets unpopular, expect to get it shut down. I just hope at one point in the future we'll have some means of actually playing them. I would love to be able to revisit Firefall or WildStar or Evolve or even Babylon's Fall. But for me, for today, that's gonna do it. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one, yeah? I was the burglar all along. Bye, see ya.